Hey honey, I'm glad for every sorrow that I had. And I'm glad for every burden, without this old heart to weigh me down, I'd fly away for certain. My mom was my first guitar teacher. She played guitar for us, just like awesome, simple campfire songs, cowboy chords. And I was always really drawn to the music that she was making in that capacity. And I also, this all started in middle school. I had a couple very good friends who were learning to play guitar all at the same time. So we, I ended up painting my whole house for my parents in exchange for my first guitar. And in retrospect, I realized they got a pretty good deal out of that.
Sure did.
They really did. But I did also only kind of a mediocre job because I was 12. Yeah, learning chords from her, and then the transition into folk music took some time. I was like a rocker at first, like playing, wanting to play lead electric guitar and like learning Metallica songs, and total opposite end of the spectrum style-wise. And then it really wasn't until I started writing poetry, which happened more in college, that I began to see the sort of literary and lyrical value of folk music, and that was when I started to make that pivot into that form. Traded in the electric guitar for acoustic guitar, started getting into fingerstyle playing, getting really deep into the sort of storytelling of the folk genre. I guess the rest is history. Then in terms of other instruments, I do play some bass and drums, but badly, but enthusiastically, yeah. I mean, my influences certainly, as I was getting into the folk songwriting, were largely the people who were most interested in having the text be really like foregrounded. So Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen are kind of like my longest term idols. And then more recent songwriters like Joanna Newsom, Gillian Welch, Nick Cave, Shane MacGowan from the Pogues, Colin Meloy from the Decemberists. In the Aeroplane Over the Sea was a really crucial record for me from Neutral Milk Hotel, Jeff Mangum. So kind of everybody who was showing the sort of like outer limits of what was possible to convey language-wise in a song. And then I think in terms of, who encouraged me to continue when the going got tough, which it frequently did, Ashley, who will be singing with me this fine evening, has been a huge supporter, influencer, teacher throughout this whole journey. And somewhat surprisingly, or perhaps not, my parents really were, my sister, were all really encouraging. Even, the hard thing about being a musician is like you're bad when you start. Like everybody is bad when they start out. Or at least I was, and I tell myself everybody was, but, those, yeah, one would hope. But to have those folks who are kind of willing to be patient with you as you learn what you're doing and get better and learn the craft and learn, like how to perform, how to compose for your own voice, all of these things that like, when we see a fully fledged songwriter, we assume they had it all along, but the truth is that everybody has this long road to get there. And so, yeah, family and those dear friends who were patient with me while I was learning, that was like the key.
They were like, "No, that was great."
Yeah, I know. Grinding their teeth, putting their earplugs in. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, I think part of the heart of folk music to me is that who counts as folk is always changing. And I hope that the sort of determination of what is folk music continues to broaden. I mean, it's like fresh on my mind that Taylor Swift just like this week released an album called Folklore, which is not a folk album. It's a really interesting, cool album, and it features a lot of great musicians and outstanding songwriting. I think she's an excellent songwriter, but it's not folk in the strict tradition, I guess, of like it being this open, community-based, collaborative thing. I mean, on some level, the very premise of dropping a surprise record is like the opposite of folk, because people should have been on board all along. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I do think that, some of the people who are most that I feel most excited about seeing their career unfold are those musicians who are trying to break down the boundary between who is a performer and who is an audience member. Really the Okie Dokie Brothers, they're a folk band based out of Minneapolis that's like geared towards kids, but it's really conscientious and thoughtful about the sort of roots of folk music. They're doing a lot more like sing-alongs and sort of family-based stuff and things where they're there to facilitate a music experience, but they're not there to like be the center of attention, because I think in some ways that's not what folk is about. You know, it's like much more about making everyone feel like they're a contributor to this thing. You know, and certainly there are folks who are carrying the torch in that more traditional sense. I do think of Gillian Welch and David Rawlings as a couple of the sort of key figures in the sort of more recent generation of folk singers. But then I also think that, you know, like in terms of what the ethic of folk music is, I think that like rap is a folk music idiom. Like it's an idiom that is usable and belongs to people and is like replicable and variable and yeah, and so collaborative, like you're saying. So I think that like that's a great example of something that, you know, when we say folk music, we're applying this kind of aesthetic set of expectations, like, oh, it's going to be like, you know, a guy with a guitar or whatever, but really it's more about like the ethic of the music and how that music gets shared and how it gets circulated. So I think that there are all kinds of collaborative sort of projects that are embodying that folk ethic, even though it may be strictly electronic instruments and it may not look like what you think of folk as having looked like historically. So that's where my head's at with that stuff. My creative process is sort of the inverse, I think, of most songwriters. I think a lot of songwriters typically begin with their music, begin with the chords and the melody, and then kind of retrofit lyrics to that. And for better and for worse, I'm always writing the lyrics first because my background is like more in writing than in music. And my excitement is always most thoroughly toward, like I said, the language, the text, the rhyme schemes, the repetition, the sort of turn of phrase. So I often end up just like writing songs in a notebook without an instrument at all, without any sound being made, and then pull out the guitar after the fact and figure out a way to present that text with some small amount of musical accompaniment. I do feel like that is often kind of limiting in terms of what happens with the melodies. It ends up being like a little more square sometimes, as opposed to like the folks who are writing the melody first and then doing the lyrics after. But yeah, that process is something I'm trying to change up and trying to experiment with and make myself uncomfortable. It's a mixed blessing to have been doing this for long enough and have been teaching it for long enough that like I know the sort of right way to do stuff, and I miss the time when I used to not know, because that mess was like a beautiful mess.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, I think that the pluses and minuses of trying to make it in the music industry, certainly the plus is like infinite flexibility and the kind of opportunity to take seriously the music that you're making. I think a lot of people, when you only think of it as a hobby, you don't think of it as something that it's appropriate to spend 8 hours a day on or something like that. And for me, that it was a key sort of moment to say, like, no, this is what I'm committing my life to, and so it counts as work to spend all day working on a song, as opposed to like that counts as messing around and not really doing anything with your day. So I think that's a huge bonus. I think certainly the opportunity to have been traveling so much, and particularly with this kind of music, meeting so many different people in so many different places because it is so collaborative, and having this skill set that kind of is really like malleable and inviting of having these cool conversations and connections. That's a huge benefit. I think the drawback now more than ever with the COVID situation and like it has suddenly become revealed how tenuous this lifestyle is and how many things have to go right for it to be possible to make it sustainable. And of course people are trying to pivot to virtual concerts and doing different kind of stuff like that, and it's never going to be quite the same, and I fear that the music industry may never look the way that it did in 2019. Like, I don't think it will come back anytime soon necessarily. The good news is that songwriters and musicians are creative people, and so we're figuring out new ways to like put together a living, and I think that's the piece of advice that I would give to young songwriters too. Nice. There it comes. Sounds so gong-like. oddly
Okay.
pleasing. Yeah, it's just, yeah, right. Is like I think that people sometimes have a picture of like, oh, this is exactly what a music career is supposed to look like. I'm going to put out a record on X schedule. I'm going to tour however often. I'm going to do this, 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 and this. And what I have discovered in my own career, at least, is that it has been most successful when I've brought a kind of outside the box approach, not just to the songs, but to the career itself. So like, how can I repurpose or repackage or reallocate the things that I'm doing into different contexts so that it's not just trying to show up at a club and put out a record and go on a tour. Like, that's kind of uncreative because that's what everybody does. And conversely, I've seen that when I do weird things or even something like this that's like a combination of a lecture and performance, and it draws on my academic background and my performing background, or I have a company that I started with a friend of mine several years ago where we're doing poetry and songwriting mentorship for people on the autism spectrum. And this has ended up being the most rewarding, incredible work. And also it's like a huge piece of where my income is coming from, especially now when touring isn't happening. And that's something that like arose sort of organically out of the things that I was already doing. And so, like I said, just being able to use that skill set and serve people in different ways for it. And I guess thinking of it as a service, not like everyone should pay me for how awesome my songs are, but like what can I give in exchange for that sort of encounter. I know the words to so many songs and I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. I learned so many, the first one that comes to my mind, and I say this with love, is a song called Cumbersome by 7 Mary 3. Like, for some reason, I know every note of that, every word. It's got, so it's good. It's like good, bad. Yeah, I think I'm going to put a period after that one, though.